In the morning of the 28th of July 2010, AirBlue Flight 202 was a scheduled domestic passenger service between Karachi and Islamabad in Pakistan. The aircraft being flown was a 4-year-old Airbus A321, which is the slightly stretched version of the very common Airbus A320 family. To operate together on this flight had vastly different experience levels. The captain was a 61-year-old with close to 25,500 hours, which is a lot. He had around 1,000 hours of experience on the Airbus A320 family, and he had previously, just a few years earlier, worked for a different airline. The officer, on the other hand, was 34 years old and had around 1,900 hours of total experience, with only slightly less than 300 hours on the Airbus A320. Because of this, they decided during the pre-flight that the captain was going to be the pilot flying for the flight because of the complexity of the potential circling later on. And it was really miserable with heavy rains, low clouds and reasonably poor visibility. And the weather has been like that for the previous 2 weeks prior to the flight. The only way to actually land on runway 12 would be for the pilots to execute an approach procedure into runway 30, and then, providing if the weather was good enough, they would have to do a visual circling maneuver to runway 12. At time 0241, that's 7:41 local time, so quite early in the morning, AirBlue Flight 202 took off from Karachi and started flying down towards Islamabad. About 11 minutes into the flight, the cabin crew came in and served the pilots a couple of croissants and some tea, and the captain apparently found that this was the perfect opportunity to start testing the technical and operational knowledge of the first officer. To the final report, the captain did so in a very snobbish, degrading and humiliating way, and apparently he wasn't very happy with the answers he was getting from his much more junior first officer. So this grilling continued on and off for about 1 hour of the flight, and throughout this ordeal the first officer became more and more quiet. Anyway, the captain continues to set up the cockpit for an approach in this way. The first officer sees this happening, but he doesn't say anything, and the captain starts creating these PBD FMC waypoints. Now, PBD stands for Point Bearing Distance, and basically the way that you do this, if you want to make your own waypoints, is that you find a fixed point and then you set a bearing and a distance from that point in order to create a new point. About 6 minutes later, the air traffic controller came back and said that they could expect radar vectors for an ILS approach runway 30 with a circuit to land runway 12. This was read back by the first officer, who once again asked if it would be possible for them to do a right-hand circling instead of a left-hand circling. Air traffic control came back and said that no, that is not possible due to local restrictions. Expect a right-hand turn for a left-hand circling. Well, as they were descending in now, the captain told the first officer to create a similar waypoint to the east of the airport instead. First officer didn't seem to mind to do this. At time 0434, AirBlue Flight 202 received their final vector and a descent clearance to 3,900 feet to intercept the ILS approach for runway 30. Flaps to slow the aircraft down, and once they were established on the ILS, they were transferred over to Islamabad Tower. The pilots had set their altitude selector to 2,500 feet, which is the minimum descent altitude for the circling. But during the descent on the glide slope, the captain suddenly reached over and set 2,000 feet instead. This was actually picked up by the first officer, who said no, the MDA is 2,500 feet like we briefed, and the altitude selector was set back up again. But that would also mean that he would have less descent clearance during the actual circling maneuver, and it shows a bit of a mindset of the captain. The tower controller also tells them to consider doing a bad weather circuit, possibly referring to making the circuit as tight as possible because of the bad visibility. But in response to that, the captain inside of the cockpit just mutters to the first officer, let him say whatever he wants to say, possibly indicating that he has some plans of his own. Soon after this, the captain also reaches over and reduces the altitude selector from 2,500 feet to 2,300 feet. The first officer doesn't speak up this time, and the aircraft starts descending. This is now violating the minimum descent altitude during the circling and reducing the available terrain clearance for the aircraft. The next thing that happens is that the captain now tells the first officer that he intends to go into the managed nav mode, following the route that the first officer created before. But he doesn't actually engage the nav mode. Instead, he continues in the selected heading mode, going outbound on a heading of 352 degrees. The first officer says, "Okay, sir, but are you visual?" And the captain responds, "Visual line, okay." and the aircraft continues to fly outbound, further and further away from the airport. At times 04:39 and 32 seconds, the captain turned the heading bug to 300 degrees. This makes the aircraft parallel the landing runway and is now heading straight towards their created waypoint PBD-11. As he's doing so, he also pushes in the heading selector. This engages the managed nav mode, so from this point onward, the aircraft is going to try to follow whatever route is in the FMC. They're now at about 3.5 miles away from the runway, and they're out of sight from tower and quickly becoming closer to the outer limit of the 4.2 nautical mile protected circling area. Trawler calls up the tower and asks him what the aircraft is doing. This prompts the tower controller to call up the aircraft and tell them to immediately turn left to avoid flying into the restricted area, and from this point onwards, things are going to start happening very, very quickly. Within a few seconds from this call, the first
"Terrain ahead"
warning is issued in the cockpit. As this first warning is heard, the first officer speaks up and he says, "Sir, the higher ground has reached. Sir, there is terrain ahead. Sir, turn left." The captain can now be heard on the cockpit voice recorder becoming jittery and stressed. This was clearly not something that he had anticipated, and it's likely that these increased stress levels that is now hitting him further degrades his situational awareness, because the aircraft just continues flying towards the waypoint. The tower controller now calls up the aircraft and asks the pilots to please confirm that they're still visual with the runway, and the first officer doesn't know what to respond to this, so he just turns over to the captain and asks, "What should I tell him?" And when the tower controller repeats the same question again, both pilots goes onto the frequency at the same time and said, "Affirm, Air Blue Flight 202, we're visual with the terrain." That is further accompanied by 2 more EGPWS warnings, and to that the captain finally responds, "Yes, we're turning." And he's the stress that captain is now likely feeling. He just keeps turning the bug more and more to the left until it actually ends up on a heading of 086 degrees. This is where the captain finally pulls out the heading selector, switching it over to the selected mode instead. But remember, the heading is now set to 086 degrees. The aircraft is on a heading of 300 degrees. This means that the quickest way for the aircraft to turn to the selected heading is not left like the captain wants it to do, it is right. And that's what the aircraft is doing. It starts turning to the right, bringing the aircraft further into the Margalla Hills, further in towards the higher terrain. Now, more and more terrain ahead EGPWS warnings can be heard in the cockpit, and they subsequently turn into
"Terrain ahead, pull up."
The first officer can now be heard pleading, "Sir, turn left, sir, pull up, sir, pull up." But it doesn't go as far as to actually take controls from the clearly confused and bewildered captain and execute the terrain escape maneuver himself. At times 04:40 and 33 seconds, there is some indications that the captain is doing a meager effort to try to comply with the terrain warning. He moves the thrust levers into the flex detent, which is not toga, but it increases the thrust, and it also disconnects the auto throttle. He also sets 3,700 feet in the altitude selector, and this causes the aircraft to start climbing. But only seconds later, he reduces the altitude back down to 3,100 feet, and he brings the thrust levers back into climb thrust again, which once again re-engages the auto thrust. In the cockpit, the first officer continues to plead with the captain, "Sir, pull up!" But the captain seems to still be in the mindset to get this aircraft down on the ground. He continues to turn the heading bug more and more to the left, ending up at a value of 025 degrees. But since that's still in the mind of the autopilot indicating a right-hand turn, that's what the aircraft continues to do. At times 04:40 and 46 seconds, the captain finally decides to take matters into his own hands. He disconnects the autopilot and he induces full left side stick together with some left rudder, and those two actions together causes a rapid roll to the left up to a maximum value of 52 degrees. At that time, the aircraft was actually climbing at 2,770 feet, and it reached as high as 3,110 feet before the combination of the high bank angle and the captain now inputting forward side stick, causing the aircraft to start descent. And the descent reaches 3,000 feet per minute with a negative attitude of 4.6 degrees. Since the auto thrust was now re-engaged, the fact that the aircraft is now pitching forward causes the engines to spool back in order to try to maintain the airspeed, causing further pitch down. This increasing descent rate, together with the roll and the already low terrain clearance, now made this accident unavoidable. And the last thing that was recorded on the cockpit voice recorder was the first officer meekly speaking up saying, "Sir, we are going down. Sir, we are going down." 41 and 8 seconds, the aircraft crashes into the Margalla Hills, 9.6 miles away from the airport at an altitude of 2,858 feet. All 146 passengers and 6 crew members perish in the accident.